Top Med Talk.
Monty Mythen here. As we prepare to move into the next phase of the COVID crisis, we're going to be widening our focus here on Top Med Talk. We will continue to deliver COVID-specific programs, but we all have a huge additional responsibility as we try to reboot normal services. So although this piece is not directly related to COVID-19, we believe it's information that is crucial to the bigger task of rebuilding the healthcare system as we learn to adapt and live with this new virus. Thank you to our sponsors and to you, our listeners, for helping us to share this important information.
Well, hello, I'm Desiree Chappell, and this is Top Med Talk. We are partnering with the American Association of Nurse Anesthetists for the 2019 Annual Congress here in Chicago, Illinois. The AANA 2019 is a gathering of over 3,000 certified registered nurse anesthetists, or CRNAs, for the largest networking and educational event in nurse anesthesia. Now, over the course of the next 3 days, Top Med Talk is going to be sitting down with some of the presenters, key opinion leaders, AANA leadership, and delegates to discuss hot topics in the CRNA community and anesthesia practice in general. And as always, I'm joined by Editor-in-Chief of Top Med Talk, Monty Mythen. Hello, Monty.
Morning, Desiree.
How are you?
Very good indeed.
Yeah?
Very good.
Excited about the conversations that we
Yeah, absolutely. We've already had a fantastic start to the day, great conversation, and as I pointed out earlier, it's great to be back in Chicago.
It is.
What a great city.
It is.
With our local host.
We have our local host and partner in Top Med Talk, Saul Aronson. Hello, Saul. How are you?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we're excited to be able to have a discussion this morning about protecting your healthcare practice, talking about compliance and enforcement. And we have Mark Silberman, who is the General Counsel to the American Association of Nurse Anesthetists. Mark, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
My absolute pleasure.
Well, listen, a voice for podcasting, that's for sure.
That is an awesome voice.
It's early. It's my AM radio listening.
You've done a little voiceover in the past?
In the past, I have.
Yeah, so you're a man of many talents, apparently.
Limited talents, but I try to get from as far as I can with each.
Thank you again for sitting down with us. I know that you have been with the AANA for quite some time now.
This is, I think, 9 years.
9 years, okay. And you do a lot of speaking for us around the country and talking about issues, I guess, that are specific to CRNAs.
Specific to CRNAs, to fraud, to enforcement, and to anything that is important to the anesthesia community. So
yeah, I think that's great. And having you as a resource, and we can put all this up on Top Med Talk in the show notes. But contact information if the AANA, if members want to contact you and have a further discussion about questions and
absolutely.
things like that.
Always happy to help out.
Good. Well, let's dive right into it. We wanted to talk a little bit about protecting our own personal practice and about compliance. And I know there are a lot of anesthesia providers that listen to Top Med Talk that are in independent practices or that may be a part of a larger care team group. What are some of the major issues that we are faced with when it comes to billing?
So the number one issue when it comes to reimbursement and billing in healthcare at all, but specifically in anesthesia as well, is right now the enforcement landscape is more aggressive than it's ever been. You have a lot of money that is being transferred with regards to healthcare, and whether you're talking about the government or whether you're talking about private billers or payers, they want to get as much of that money back as they can. And when you consider the healthcare delivery system, once the healthcare has been provided, then they're fighting over the money. So it's not like you can take back the anesthesia that was administered after the procedure. And the biggest challenge I think that most providers are facing is making sure that they have the appropriate documentation and making sure that they understand what all of the regulations are. And so in those circumstances, knowledge is power. And so I think that's the biggest challenge, is making sure that providers, because no one went to medical school, no one became a CRNA, no one got into healthcare because they wanted to be a healthcare administrator, because they wanted to actually provide care and do that. But it's become the responsibility of healthcare providers across the board to make sure that they know everything they can with regards to billing and making sure that the notes are there, the information is there to justify, because the government's making aggressive audits trying to get back or recoup money or withhold.
So Mark, I've worked in the system in the USA, so I've been subject to a life of billing and getting the notation right, etc., etc. In the UK, we don't go through the whole billing process. The documentation is important, but not for billing purposes necessarily. What are the common errors that people make unintentionally? We'll possibly get on to people who are misbehaving a bit later, but what are the The common mistakes.
So one of the most common mistakes, especially that becomes a problem during an audit, is people get into patterns. And so what they do is they'll repeat the same information all the time, just out of habit. We know that each patient is individual, each care is individual, but especially when people are using electronic medical records.
Exactly.
What happens is the government can say, well, it appears that they're cutting and pasting the same note. Or they will say that it doesn't appear to be a unique and independent note, and then they'll challenge whether or not it's legitimate, whether or not it justifies. And the problem becomes, oftentimes you can justify and explain this, but the time, the energy, the expense to defend what you did, what I tell people is this: the biggest focus is avoiding the problem, not being able to solve it.
So because many of our systems are driven by drop-down menus now, and many of the descriptors are generic and reproducible, so information is red, hot, swollen, and tender. Now, I can change the word order, but I can't. There's only so much I can do with that.
Well, and I think the idea becomes is that what I tell people is don't try to change what you're doing, but always be able to have an explanation for what you did and why you did.
Okay.
And what I always tell people, if you don't have an explanation for why you did something, the government is most likely going to substitute their own explanation for why they think you did it. And more often than not, you won't like what explanation they come up with.
You know, what's interesting, in our EMR, you're actually encouraged to come up with smart phrases. And you know, I know physicians and all providers do this. I mean, I have like a set thing that I, do after induction and, put in different parts of my charting that are smart phrases that I've come up with that are kind of catch-alls. But I mean, is that something that could be used against me?
In theory, it can. The problem becomes consistency is good because consistency gets you into a pattern and it makes sure if you have a good system and you're using something, what I tell people is in any EMR they work with, if there's a space where they can have some degree of individualized attention, something that's going to bring them back to that patient that at the end of the day, if you're doing something that you do 15 times a day and it's standard, then it makes sense that there's going to be a standardized note. Where you run into problems is when something unusual happened and there's nothing in the record that reflects it.
Okay.
So, and that, by the way, is also not only from an enforcement, but also from a potential liability. So I always tell people to make sure that they have something that is going to help them recall that instance if it's ever likely that they're going to have to be able to recall it.
That's very helpful because I work mainly in critical care. So if we're putting a line in, doing a specific procedure, a cut and paste note, it's not going to be any different. It's the deviation from the normality where we put our energy into making a note, which is we primarily do for ourselves, is when we look back, can we remember exactly what happened?
So the other thing I'll tell you that, especially when you're talking something like critical care, the focus is and should be on the welfare of the patient in front of you.
Absolutely.
One of the things that people will often do is they'll go from one crisis to another, and it won't be until later they come back. And what I will tell people, there's absolutely nothing wrong with post-dating or post-entering a note. You just need to document the fact that it's being entered after the fact.
Oh, that's a good point, because I think that wasn't – I can think of back in my own personal practice where you're trying to like almost contemporaneously write the note or think back to when, you were writing it as it was happening. But actually saying...
And in an ideal world, you do. In an ideal world, you do it contemporaneously. And we've all seen that just in healthcare, where our healthcare provider doing maybe even a physical stops and starts...
Yeah, making notes.
And it's a little annoying, but we understand that's part of it. But when you can't, still go back and just document the fact of why you did it later.
So it's okay to say, look, it was crazy busy. No one had any time to make notes.
Best circumstance I had was a client was being interviewed, and the government said, it looks like you did this 7 days later. Why didn't you do this contemporaneously? And the answer was, there was a major car accident, and we were worried about keeping people alive. I wasn't really concerned about the notes. It's a good answer. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's good. I know that I saw a presentation that you did, and you're talking about, over documentation and under documentation.
The idea is you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah.
So in any government investigation, whatever information you have is going to be used against you, right?
And this is for all healthcare providers.
This is for all healthcare providers. Yeah. This is all, very candidly, this is sort of true of all government enforcement. Whatever documentation, they're going to use that documentation. That is your story. That is going to be what happened, why it happened, how it happened. And they will use that against you. If you don't have documentation, then they're going to use the absence of it against you. And so it's one of those circumstances where it's a horribly tough balance, right? Where, okay, so wait, I can't do the same thing every time, but if I do it differently every time, they're going to focus? And the answer is somewhat yeah. There is a catch-22 to this, but what I tell people is, and I said this earlier, always have a reason for what you're doing. So why you document, how you document, what you do, because at the end of the day, when someone comes back, whether it's an audit, whether it's an internal compliance program, and you're just trying to check and see how you're doing and are you doing things right, what you want to be able to do is figure out why did I do, what did I do, and what was my reasoning, and what your explanation is will then either, well, you made a mistake and then you have to correct it, or there's a problem with what you did and then you deal with it.
Mark, I think it's really interesting that we continuously try to balance those forces and tensions of productive pressures and being effective and efficient and just simply being honest and demonstrating, documenting what we do. Speak to us, if you will, from your experience, how the productive pressures on healthcare providers has influenced our abilities to document effectively, and if you could also just weigh in on the electronic health records influence on that balance and tension.
Well, so look, the first thing I'm going to say, you'll notice nothing I've talked about has anything to do with the welfare of the patient. And that's a problem because it pulls your focus away from what you're actually there to do, which is provide care. And so what the one guidance I give across the board, if you have to choose, provide quality health care. If the explanation is I screwed up on billing because I was focused on providing good health care, I will take those facts always. The problem with the electronic medical record is most EMRs weren't, and they're getting better. I don't want to, but originally these weren't designed to be medical records. They were designed to be billing records. And so what it does is it shifts some of the focus away from healthcare and onto billing. These were designed to make sure that you had all of the necessary elements to get paid, but that isn't necessarily what's in the best interest of the patient. And so that's one of the biggest challenges is trying to figure out how do I balance what is needed to provide care, to be able to make sure that I'm communicating to other healthcare professionals so that I know what happened and why things were done with regards to a specific patient. But then the pressure becomes if you don't get it right, if you don't have the documentation, you don't get paid, which is time then again spent away from providing health care. So it's a constant struggle, I think, that is exhausting to a lot of healthcare providers.
Have you noticed any trends in the last year or three?
Other than the idea that enforcement efforts are still growing high, and I think one of the things we're seeing is there's more aggressive actions in the False Claims Act. And the False Claims Act, I'll do a real quick. The False Claims Act is a law that effectively says if you submit a false bill to a government payer, whether it has an omission, whether it has inaccurate information, and that mistake was material to the government's payment, that can become a false claim, and the government can come back and get the money back for it. There's what's called a provision of this where private people, qui tam relators, can actually bring these charges on behalf of the government, and the sole goal of this is to take back money. And so if you consider it like this, when it comes to anesthesia, most healthcare enforcement efforts, most investigations don't involve 10,000 mistakes. They involve one mistake that was repeated 10,000 times. And so when you consider how many times an anesthetic is delivered, how many times, if there's some flaw in either the documentation, the process, there are people out there who are trying to figure out how can I bring this case to the government's attention? Because what happens is the government either intervenes, they bring the case on, and the person who raised this issue, or the lawyer, can get a percentage of what's recovered. Or even if the government doesn't want to take the case, they can still go forward and get an even bigger percentage. And so too much of money is driving what's happening in healthcare.
So there's an industry of people looking for mistakes in billing.
There's an industry, and people are using analytics for it, and they're using data to drive this. They're using, candidly, employees or former employees to get this information because you need to have some degree of insight as to what's happening. And people are looking for problems, not necessarily to solve the problem, but because it might yield a payday for them.
Wow, that's really
and if you make, and I'm not sure if places have yet, a transition to sort of accountable care type of organisations where there's a payment per capita, that don't a lot of those issues just go away because providing you can demonstrate you're looking after people well.
So that idea of shared risk and that idea of a single pool is great. Here's the problem. What happens if you're looking at a shared pool of money and someone upstream from you is doing something wrong? Does that taint the pool as it comes down? And it certainly can affect the amount of resources there are to trickle down. So, I think it's a step in the right direction, and I think it's certainly working towards trying to figure out how to get everyone to communicate together.
If you inadvertently are involved in billing errors, not willfully but accidentally, is it primarily the recovery of the funds that happens as opposed to you might be going to jail now?
Certainly, and a lot of the government enforcement efforts are civil, where they're just looking to get back money. But I think we've all seen and heard about circumstances where you have individuals who are intentionally trying to defraud the government. And, there are people who have gotten substantial prison sentences.
Turns into a criminal case.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Well, because at some point it can be theft. We see situations where people are making up care that's provided. One of the most famous cases was a doctor out of Michigan who was faking people's cancer diagnoses so as to give them chemotherapy and was actually administering, chemo to people who didn't have cancer.
Oy vey.
You're right.
Yes, that would be something I think we can all agree we're against.
I think, Mark, it's fair to say that we're all human. Humans make mistakes, and that expands into billing efforts. If you find that out in the rears, you report it. You just have to be honest.
So, and that's the one thing I tell people, and you might have seen that in my PowerPoint, is I have a picture of the ostrich with the head, and there's don't pretend you don't have a problem if you do. Yeah. Right? And so the one thing that I'm really pushing for is the firm that I'm at, we've created what we've called our GRACE initiative. And it's government regulatory avoidance, compliance, and enforcement. And instead of audit, we're talking about avoidance. And the reason is once you do an audit, you can find mistakes, you can look at your compliance program, you can be diligent, and if you find a mistake, you're right. You just report it, return the money, it's good. Avoidance is better. And the reason is the audit finds the mistake that was already made. Mm-hmm. Avoidance focuses on how do we set it up so we don't have the problem to begin with. And I'll tell you something. This idea came from one of my close friends. She's an oncologist. And she and I realized we had the same frustration. When people wait too long to come to us for help, there's less we can do. It tends to be more expensive, more painful, less likely to have a positive outcome. But if they coordinate with us earlier, it's amazing how much we can do to avoid, solve, and mitigate any risk. And so that's the idea, is I tell people, take the advice that our healthcare professionals are getting, right? What do they tell us? Get a routine physical. Know what your risk factors are. Be honest if you're having symptoms. Healthcare providers should be doing that themselves. Look at their own systems and figure out, am I at risk? Are there problems I might have? Figure it out. And if the answer is no, great. Go forward with a good bill of health. And if there are, solve it before someone brings it to your attention.
Let me twist that for a moment and ask you to speak to, by your experience, the unintended, if you will, consequence through the other lens, which is to say sometimes they're carriers, not government necessarily, but carriers, who by virtue of a computer recoding or glitch just simply don't pay us what we deserve. Happens. Speak to that, if you will. It's a two-way street.
It's amazing how quickly they want their money back and how slowly they want
to pay you.
And I'll tell you, you're right. It's true with private payers. With regards to government, here's where it's actually worse. The False Claims Act. Yeah. It is now at a point where if you identify an overpayment that you received and you don't turn it over within 60 days, that can now become a false claim it's called a reverse false claim, where you didn't return the money. And I've had people say, I found $20,000 that the government accidentally paid me, but they currently owe me $3 million. Can I just keep this? And the government's position is no.
Let me guess. No.
So but also I'll tell you, in anesthesia providers, this is true. One of the most common misunderstandings I see is, well, I assigned my billing rights, so I don't have to worry about any of this. What gets billed under your NPI is your responsibility. And so that's one of those areas where it's in everyone's best interest to get it right. And what I always encourage is for people to be transparent about what bills are going out, because if you have an honest mistake, however and wherever it is, you want to catch it, find it, and resolve it. Because otherwise, no offense, you end up paying too much money and too much time with someone like me, and it's generally worth avoiding.
Can I take you back to the Goldilocks over-recording, under-recording?
Sure.
What's the over-recording bit? Is that writing stuff down that gets you into trouble because you're giving away too much? It's It's not a game, is it?
No, it's not a game. And let me be candid.
Yeah.
The only time that over-documentation becomes an issue is more of either it's a liability or in the sense of, I mean, and I hate to say this, but sometimes you have not positive outcomes. And there can be lawsuits, there can be litigation. I don't work in the malpractice area, but it's one of those things where it's a reality. And then every single note, every single document, every single jot and tittle is going to be scrutinized. You want to have enough information to explain what you did, but you don't want to over-explain. With regards to the enforcement, the only issue with over-documentation tends to be the following. When the government says, we're going to look into the following, or this can also happen with a private audit. We need you to produce all of these materials, all of this information. At some point, you may need to pay a lawyer or pay someone else or yourself go through and look at all of that information. And so it's one of those things where it's unfortunate, but there's a cost that's involved with all of that. And so the idea is it's finding that balance between standardizing versus identifying what was unique about a situation. What I will tell you is, again, if your answer for how and why you're documenting is it was in the patient's best interest, you're always going to have a good answer.
Has anyone made the transition to using the equivalent of CCTV so that everything's just videoed so you can call upon that to say, well, obviously that is what happened?
See, in the OR?
Yeah, why not?
I'm going to go with a bunch of, I mean, to my knowledge,
Are
no.
they doing that in the NHS?
There actually is some preliminary work being done. It's the black box, if you will, equivalent of a cockpit in an airline, where those are being instituted in an OR, and every conversation, every sidebar conversation is recorded. And there are some institutions right now where that's being played with.
Because, that's the ultimate defense, isn't it? Look, they clearly picked up a syringe and did that at 7:24 and 13 seconds, and you can see that it was atropine.
Wow.
Appreciate that there's a lot of sidebar conversations that go on in an OR suite that are,
yes, there are everywhere.
Needing to be filtered. But it is a very interesting idea, and it is being explored right now.
And I think the idea is at some point, if you want to get to the truth of what's going on and what happened, there's value to it. But at the end of the day, we all do things a little differently when we know we're being watched. And at the end of the day, I don't want my healthcare provider worrying about how this is going to look coming back. I want them focused on me on the table. And so there's, to some degree, you got to figure out how to balance.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Wait. Yeah, we agree. It's a balance.
Yeah. So we're all shrugging our shoulders for those of you who are...
who can't see us, because we're all sitting here going, we could literally talk about this and debate this all day long. Right. So
there is, by the way, there is a component about this where it's a great idea, except for you have to acknowledge that sometimes lawyers suck. And so, and I'll take ownership of that, is that you have to, how is that information going to be used against you?
Yeah, but
hold your feet to the fire on that.
Should we be fearful of that? That's if we're just in there doing the right thing.
I think we can debate this all day long.
Okay, well, let's move on.
And the only thing I'll say is this. I deal with a lot of people who haven't done anything wrong.
Yeah.
But sometimes the cost and time involved in proving you haven't done anything wrong can still be substantial. And that's part of the problem with the system that we have. And so,
Well, so in closing, because we'll wrap up here, Mark, what are the kind of top tips that you can give to anesthesia providers when it comes to billing practices and making sure that they're following the line and doing what they're supposed to do?
Keep yourself educated as to what's going on. You need to know what's going on. You need to pay attention. So whether it's continuing education or whether it's podcasts or whether it's knowing what the trends are.
Yeah, where is the best place to get the most up-to-date information?
So with regards to it, you need to coordinate with whoever's doing your billing. You need to coordinate with your societies, because there are people who are paying attention to this. If you do your own billing, but one of the things that I think, when people have someone else responsible for their billing, coordinate and communicate. I actually encourage people to routinely do their own sort of spot checking, right? Just because, let's make sure I'm doing this right. Why? Because if someone comes in later and asks and you're doing it right, it's going to be easier. It's going to be more organized. The other thing that I tell people is pay attention to what's going on. So if you hear about some case where, oh my God, did you hear what happened with this anesthesia provider? They got into trouble for X, whatever it is. Ask yourself if you're susceptible, if there's risk, if there's anything that you can be doing to better the situation. And then the only other thing I tell people is whatever you do, If your explanation is, I did it because it was in the best interest of the patient, and if your explanation is that, I'm confident I did this and I have the following reason, right? Because sometimes the answer, well, there's nothing in your notes. You're right. And I should have documented it, but that doesn't change the fact that I did it.
And I think you referred to it earlier. I get the impression if you know something's not quite right, put your hand up early and say sorry.
Yeah.
I have a number of circumstances where people have made mistakes that if they waited for the government to find it, the government certainly would have cast it or framed it as something intentional. But it's very hard, if not impossible, right? You talked about that line between when it's an issue of money versus an issue of freedom. It's almost impossible for the government to try to talk about taking away your freedom when you walk in and say, you don't know this, but I've made the following mistake. Let's talk about how I make it right.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So great to end on there. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us here at the AANA 2019 Annual Congress. I think it's great information not only for CRNAs, but healthcare providers alike. So we really appreciate you taking the time.
It's my absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. And like I said before at the start, we will make sure that we put your contact information in our show notes. So if anybody wants to reach out to you, and that'd be great. Again, thanks for listening to Top Med Talk. Check us out on all your favorite social media platforms, Facebook, LinkedIn, and of course Twitter. And go to topmedtalk.com to see where we're going to be coming to you from next.
Where do people find Mark? Where does he hang out? Did we touch on that?
Mark, where do you hang out?
Here in Chicago, I'm a partner at Benesch. I am the vice chair of the firm's healthcare group and chair of the firm's government investigations and white collar.
Fantastic.
Wow.
We'll put that in the show note too.
Yeah, so if you heard a white collar crime, you need a lawyer. No, I'm kidding.
Here's the real trick. Call me early and avoid it altogether.
There you go.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks again. Cheers.
Top Med Talk.
Nick Majerison here. Have you got yourself onto edpom.org yet? If not, you might not be aware EdPom Chicago. Tickets are free for a limited period only. Go now to edpom.org. Evidence-based perioperative medicine. edpom.org.